Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jenny Koch, and I'm a Senior Associate Planner with Roadside in Harwell in Alexandria, Virginia. But today I'm representing the Sustainable Communities Division of APA, and we are the host for today's webinar. Please note that this webinar is eligible for 1.5 CM credits for AICP for live viewing only. We want to start out with acknowledging our great sponsors. Thank you to all these organizations who help us put on events such as this webinar and other events. Our sponsors this year include Clarion, Dewberry, Farr Associates, HAF, Niche Engineering, Robinson & Cole, Smith Group JJR, U.S. Green Building Council, CDP Engineers, Montgomery Associates, TESCA, and TransformativeTools.org. So thank you again to our sponsors and to all of our members whose contributions also support our work. If you'd like to get involved with the division or if you have ideas you want to share for webinars or other activities, feel free to contact us using any of these methods. Our blog website here is a great resource for everything from our e-bulletins to information about the Sustainability Champions Program, which is a national network, and an archive of materials from all of our webinars. It will include material from this webinar either later today or early tomorrow. Before we dive into the speakers for today's webinar, which is focused on some of our award-winning projects from last year's Awards for Excellence in Sustainability, I wanted to go ahead and give you a brief overview of this year's Awards for Excellence in Sustainability. The awards announcement was released on November 9th, and nominations are due January 18th, 2018, so you still have over a month to submit. There are 10 categories this year, as you can see here, and the 3 that are bold on this slide are those that were changed or added from last year. So take note of that. All the information that you'll need to submit for an award can be found in our information packet, which is on our blog website and on the APA website. Both of those links are on the next slide. And just some brief notes. If you're looking to submit something, each plan, project, tool, etc. can only be nominated in one category per year. Judges can transfer a nomination to a different category if they see fit. There's a set of evaluation criteria for each category, and those are all shown in the information packet. But it looks at things such as creativity and innovation, compatibility with other planning efforts and community goals, effectiveness and results, collaboration and engagement, and transferability. All submissions will be judged by a panel of experts against those criteria. And again, you can find more information about the criteria and the awards in general in the information packet. As I noted, submissions are due in January 19th, which is a Friday, and it will be uploaded to Dropbox in a single file. As I said, here are the 2 links where you can download the information packet, and those will also be at the very end of our presentation today. So, as I noted, today we are talking about 3 award-winning projects from the 2017 Awards for Excellence in Sustainability. And they are all very different projects, which is, we want to give you an idea of how planners plan for a variety of ideas about sustainability at all scales and very different locations. Unfortunately, our speaker from Kansas City downtown, Streetcar, had sort of a personal emergency come up and is unable to be here, but I will be speaking briefly about their project on their behalf. But we do have speakers representing 2 other plans, and I'd like to introduce them briefly. Speaking about the South Central Waterfront Vision Framework Plan, which is in Austin, Texas, we'll have 3 speakers. Lizzie Smith is a senior planner with the City of Austin's Planning and Zoning Department in the Urban Design Division. Her work focuses on bringing community vision to reality through land use and redevelopment policy and planning. Before joining the city in 2012, Lizzie worked in the private sector producing comprehensive market studies, buildable land assessment, and program evaluation for both public and private sector clients. Alan Holt has had a career focused on promoting well-planned, vibrant, healthy communities through urban design. After obtaining his Master of Architecture from Columbia University, Alan spent his early career working for architectural offices in New York City. From there, he went on to practice in Massachusetts, both in private practice and later as Deputy Director for Design and Construction for the city of New Bedford. In 2010, he left New England for Austin, Texas, to become a principal planner for the Urban Design Division of the City of Austin. In 2015, Alan was awarded with the Community Service Award for his leadership with the South Central Waterfront Initiative. The third speaker for this project is Scott Katafa, who has led design and management on a range of project types from planning and site design to cultural landscape research and preservation. He comes to landscape architecture with prior professional experience as a public art administrator and open space advocate. He brings his experience with community-based design processes to his current design and planning work and sees design as a way to engage communities and build consensus. Speaking about the Millville EcoDistrict Pivot Plan, we have two speakers. Zaheen Hussain is a native of Bangladesh and a Pittsburgh transplant by way of Connecticut. He now serves as Millville's Sustainability Coordinator. Supported through New Sun Rising and working with Millville EcoDistrict Collaborative, Zaheen is a shared community resource that helps advance Millville's EcoDistrict goals in the areas of food, water, energy, mobility, air quality, and equity. Prior to his work in Millville, Zaheen worked on various sustainability initiatives as a project manager at G-Tech Strategies. Christine Mondor has been active in shaping places, processes, and organizations through her work as an architect, educator, and activist. As strategic principal of Evolve EA, she has led teams on award-winning projects that include buildings and landscapes, educational efforts, and sustainability planning. She has spoken internationally about eco-districts and living buildings. She teaches architecture, landscape, and sustainability at Carnegie Mellon University, and has served in leadership roles for organizations that promote design and the environment. So I did want to note as well that we're hoping to have time at the end of the webinar for questions. So please send any questions along via the chat box, and I will give them out to our presenters at the end. If you'd like a specific person to respond, or if your question's about a specific project, just make sure you include that information in your question. So as I noted, I will be speaking briefly about the Kansas City Streetcar project. This project, the Kansas City Streetcar, opened in 2016, and it's a really great example of a project that was both completed in a sustainable manner and provides lasting sustainability benefits. It was among the fastest federally funded streetcar projects ever completed, moving swiftly from initial planning to revenue service in about 5 years. The project capitalized on concurrent infrastructure improvements, which not only saved money and avoided a second bridge closure, but also served as a visible sign to the community that the streetcar system was actually happening and that it was on its way. We always say in our awards information packets that we know it takes a village to do these projects. And so we always want to make sure we recognize the team behind the project. So as listed here, you can see there were many, many groups involved in making this streetcar a reality. The streetcar is free to ride and will continue to be free to ride in part because the Transportation Development District, which is the special benefit district established around the route, was uniquely structured to not only fund the project's construction, but also to continue to sustainably fund its operation for the next 20 years. The streetcar contributes to Kansas City's Smart City Initiative, which is a partnership with Cisco Systems to develop the most comprehensive smart city network in North America. The route includes 13 interactive informational kiosks, intelligent streetlights, and pedestrian signals, as well as corridor-wide Wi-Fi access. The system had more than 700,000 riders in the first 3.5 months of service and spurred hundreds of millions of dollars in economic development. With all this positive reception and community support, there is already planning for an extension underway. Just as a final note, the Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure awarded the Kansas City Streetcar their Envision Platinum Award for Sustainable Infrastructure, which is the highest level of their Envision rating system, and that was also the first transit project to receive that award. So that was just a very brief overview of this great project. There's a couple of links here where you can find some more information. We also included a contact email for Jennifer Schwaller at HDR at the very end of the presentation, so you should feel free to reach out to her to get more information. And with that, I will invite our speakers about the South Central Waterfront Vision Framework Plan to go ahead and start your presentation.
Hello, and this is Alan Holt, and I'm really pleased to be here today, and I'm going to be starting this presentation about the South Central Waterfront Vision Framework Plan. Scott Picasso from CMG Landscape Architects will then be talking, and it will be finished up by my colleague Lizzie Smith. So the South Central Waterfront area, it's directly across from downtown Austin, and so this 118 acres strategically located on axis with Congress Avenue, that's the main street of Texas, just a half a mile away from the state capitol. This area not only is a strategic location, but it's characterized by its lack of infrastructure. It's made up of just a handful of crisscrossed arterials and super blocks. It's about 80% impervious cover. You could drop 33 downtown blocks in this 118-acre area. And it's also made up of a patchwork, a crazy quilt of 31 private properties and only one municipally owned property, the 5 acres, where an office building where Lizzie and I work. But big changes are underway. This color-coded map basically identifies in blue 4 properties that have redeveloped in the last 4 years alone, and those other color-coded properties are properties that are very likely to redevelop within the next 10 to 15 years. Today, we have about 3 million square feet of uses, and if we had the status quo with the existing rules and regulations, most of which are 30 years old or more, the rational build-out of these redeveloping properties might take this area up to about 5 million square feet of uses, and those would be built under kind of antiquated suburban standards. And this would lead us to no improved open space, no improved connectivity, not a guarantee that we would get a single unit of affordable housing, and it would continue this kind of piecemeal, parcel by parcel approach that's characterized the chaos of this area. Today, if we consider public... Yes?
Sorry,
yes,
could you just hit hide on that, if you hit hide on that bar at the bottom of the screen?
Of course, thank you.
Great, thank you so much.
Very good. Today, if we consider the public realm, the open space plus the public right-of-way, about a quarter of this district is in public right-of-way or public realm. And under the existing status quo rules and regulation, it doesn't improve all that much. And so knowing that this was rapidly changing with huge redevelopment pressures, and that we're not going to get to a future that anyone was very excited about, the Urban Design Division started planning with no resources back in 2012. And we began that planning by getting a grant with the American Institute of Architects. And through that pro bono service, we managed to kick off a proactive community engagement that resulted in this report, the South Shore Central Report. On the coattails of that, we then partnered with the University of Texas, the School of Architecture, the Texas Futures Labs, to build upon some of the good ideas that came out of the AIA initiative. And then those two efforts allowed us to latch onto the coattails of a housing and urban development grant, the Sustainable Places Project, which allowed us to bring in some economic modeling to look at alternative futures for this area. With this work under our belt, the Urban Design Division then drafted its report to the City Council in 2014. In this interim vision framework report, we laid out the community goals and visions for this area in broad brush fashion, some diagrams, and established 3 key principles for moving forward, which I will talk about in some more detail later. With this good work under our belts, We were fortunate to then get a grant from the Environmental Protection Agency, and they in turn hired CMG landscape architects for us who were able to come in, take our community engagement to a deeper level, helped us to really elaborate and refine the community vision, and help move the bar dramatically forward in illustrating this plan and understanding the green infrastructure implications of where we could be going instead of where we were heading. Through this 4 years of planning, which was put together through the series of grants and partnerships and pro bono activity, we engaged over 1,600 people, and we had a series of walks with artists and marching bands and interactive exercises. We had a series of public talks where we brought in experts both near and far to talk about best practices in urban planning and waterfront design. We had numerous community charrettes, sometimes working with architecture schools, pro bono activities, or through the EPA. We had numerous community vision sessions. We had numerous open houses. And through all of this work, then finally in 2015, the City Council awarded us a little bit of extra money to hire some strategic consultant services with Asakura Robinson, a local landscape architecture firm, Econ Northwest, who does economic analysis for us. They're out of Portland, Oregon, and Austin's McCann-Adams Studio, which helped us refine some of the urban design ideas to finally create the South Central Waterfront Framework Report, which was adopted by the City Council in June of 2016. So this report basically says three things. For us to have a good future, we need to think district-wide, not parcel by parcel, to come up with a district approach to retrofitting a network of green spaces and green streets into this patchwork of private properties. Next, we need to create a district approach to leverage the tremendous amount of financial capital, private financial capital, that's ready to be unleashed in this area so that we could pay for this expanded public realm and to 20% affordable housing in the future, which is the goal of this plan. And third, we're going to have to do some proactive things as a city that we've not done in Austin before, but lots of cities have done it, so we know we can too. So I'm going to unpack how we had the conversation with the community, really leading with the public realm first, because everyone loves the, albeit stingy ribbon of green space along the waterfront, and everyone wants that expanded. Now, this is private properties, but nonetheless, we started working with private properties to create a vision where we could push in and expand that green space to create some intimate parks and some grander parks along the waterfront with green fingers that reach out toward the neighborhood. Next, we need to go into some of those big parcels that are likely to redevelop in the very near future and create some key infrastructure with green streets and green places. Third, we need to set up incentives and rules so that as those big parcels especially redevelop, they can participate in the vision by literally buying into the plan, by creating their own pieces of the green streets and green spaces. We need to upgrade the existing arterials to great green street standards. And now we have a rational framework for intensification of redevelopment that for the public sector to redevelop into. So today we're at this quarter of this area being in the public realm. This vision takes the amount of public realm in these 50 acres or so that are likely to redevelop in this 118-acre area up to being nearly 1/3 of this in the public realm. And so when we're talking about the public realm here, we're talking about the public right-of-ways, and so we're working with existing streets and a vision for new streets that create a new hierarchy of green streets, new trail standards, and new bicycle standards. And so these green streets, we did lots of work, but really one of the geniuses of the effort that CMG Landscape Architects and the EPA was able to do was to help us really solidify the vision for some of those great green spaces in the area. And so with that, I'm going to introduce Scott Katafa, who will take over and talk about their work and their contribution to this master planning effort.
Thank you, Alan. I think I need to share my screen.
switching of views now.
Is everyone able to see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm phoning in from San Francisco, so we're trying to coordinate this nationally here. As Alan mentioned, the EPA program, I think, provided a unique platform for the city of Austin. The EPA had this program called Greening America's Capitals that was in partnership with their Department of Housing and Urban Development as well as the Department of Transportation, and it really is to create places in the state's capitals where green infrastructure could be showcased as really a vision and a guide for cities in each of the states. In addition to that, Alan's work, really single-handedly sort of moving this master plan forward, was looking for help to sort of realize the public benefits of how this green infrastructure how increased density with green infrastructure could really benefit the surrounding communities as a way to help convince them that increased density and heights were a positive benefit for both the city as well as the neighborhood. And so when we begin a project like this or any other project, really we try to develop some common goals with the community, and so that we can all kind of have a baseline metric for evaluating design decisions as we move forward. So with the community, we developed these 6 kind of key goals for the project. And we started by really thinking about South Congress Avenue. As Alan mentioned, this is the main street of Texas. As soon as you cross the river, it doesn't feel so main anymore. And we really wanted to humanize that and create a much more hospitable entry to the South Congress district. Secondly, we wanted to connect the neighbors that are east and west of this site through the site. We wanted to create a welcoming arrival space that happens when you really, the lake, Lady Bird Lake, really creates a distinct sort of edge to downtown. You cross it, you come into a new neighborhood. How do you arrive there? How are you welcomed there? And then the 4th goal was to really invite people through the site to get to the water's edge. The 5th goal was to clean that water, all the stormwater that runs on the site. Austin has big kind of deluge storms, so large volumes of water hit impervious surfaces. They flow into these wonderful natural creeks as well as Lady Bird Lake, carrying with it non-point source pollutions into these water bodies. So we wanted to really figure out a way to use green infrastructure to clean that water before it enters these water bodies. And then finally, we wanted to create places that were as funky and idiosyncratic as Austin. That was really clear that this is not a place for sort of homogeneous kind of placemaking. That the community was really interested in something that was of Austin and authentic to the place. So with those 6 goals, we set out to design a series of spaces, 3 of which I'll talk to in more detail today. We'll start at the southern end of the site with this wonderful Bouldin Creek that moves the southern boundary of the South Central Waterfront neighborhood. It's also the edge of the Texas School for the Deaf's campus, and right now this is not a publicly accessible space, but it does form an important gateway into the neighborhood. The second space we'll talk about is Barton Springs Plaza, which sits right smack in the middle of the neighborhood, and as Alan mentioned, is at the intersection of some pretty brutal arterials that run through these mega blocks. And then finally, we'll end with a waterfront park that expands that existing hike and bike trail and creates more public amenity along the shore of Lady Bird Lake. To begin with Bouldin Creek, there's a really unique ecology here that is completely inaccessible to the public. And there's also, because of the way that the arterials move through the neighborhood, there aren't a lot of really welcoming pedestrian and bike north-south connections. So as we thought about how the northern portion of the site was going to redevelop, how the Texas School for the Deaf's campus could become more of a public amenity, we developed a site plan that opened up the creek and created 3 north-south connections for bike and peds through this space. at the same time providing the Texas School of the Deaf with some new open space amenities for their students. The existing edge of the creek has, as I mentioned, some of this really large-scale infrastructure that, because of those large storms, moves water quickly, causing erosion and degradation to the ecology of the creek. It's also fenced, so there's really no sanctioned public access into this space. So the first thing we did was establish a series of micro watersheds that take the impervious surfaces of the campus and treat them into a series of rain gardens before they enter, and minimizing the flows and then cleaning the water before entering the creek. And the school was really interested in having a disc golf course on this side of the campus, so we actually created a series of rain gardens that function as sort of disc golf hazards, so that you can move through these rain gardens playing this game of disc golf, providing this kind of new campus amenity at the same time treating the stormwater. So this is a view of the creek currently in winter with some foliage gone from the trees. And then we created a series of these canopy walks that then connect you at grade through the creek, over the creek, into the campus, and again making these north-south connections from this burgeoning new neighborhood in South Central Waterfront to a newly publicly accessible portion of the Texas School for the Deaf campus. The second site that I mentioned is the Barton Springs Plaza. This is currently, as they call it in Austin, a free right turn, which creates a really large intersection at Barton Springs Road and South Congress Avenue. It's really vehicle focused at this point, so we wanted to really try to rethink the circulation through there and provide more public benefits as part of this planning effort. So what we chose to do is to shut down that free right turn and expand this into a sort of bulb out entry plaza into the neighborhood. We looked at resizing the right-of-way to create more protected bicycle facilities, fewer travel lanes, and wider, more generous sidewalks. Incorporated into those sidewalks would be treatment gardens with a series of boardwalks over them so that we could provide shade and ambient cooling as well as stormwater treatment and improve the quality of the pedestrian realm. If you've been to Austin, you know it's very hot in the summertime, and shade and cooling are super important to make the public realm comfortable and encourage people to walk and bike. So this is a view of that free right-hand turn, an existing building on the right, a hotel to the left. There was this kind of planted island with a terrific commemoration to the bats. If you've been to Austin, you know that the South Congress bats merge right near this site. So we wanted to make this space a little bit more welcoming into the district. So we shut down that free right turn. This is a view of some of those treatment gardens with a grove of cypress and repositioning the bat sculpture to be more prominent, adding bike lanes, and activating the ground floor of this existing building with a more social and welcoming public space. And finally, we'll look at the waterfront park at Lady Bird Lake. As I mentioned, you know, this crossing here is not only a bridge, but you are 40 feet above grade from the edge of the park. And because of that grade transition, it takes about 9 minutes to walk down to the park from downtown. If we could shorten that distance, we can make it a 3-minute walk, which I think would encourage more people to consider walking to other modes of transportation. And we wanted to take advantage of that. This is a kind of a section through that existing grade change, and what we proposed was actually filling up against the abutment of the bridge with this new infill development so that you had more of a street front connection to South Congress, a more active edge, and shortening that distance and that arrival point into the South Congress neighborhood. This is a view of that bridge as you're arriving into the space. And as I mentioned before, comfort is a real concern for pedestrians and cyclists in Austin. And so we worked with the community to develop a series of these kind of test sketches through these workshops in Austin, and thinking about ways to provide shade on the bridge, thinking about ways to provide safer bike connections. And we went and developed this further to assist the South Central Waterfront planning effort. That street view is on Congress Avenue here. And then the waterfront park is divided up into 3 kind of rooms. They're kind of a bit of a barbell in plan, where we've got an active node here that is about creating a theater for the bats. To the south, we have a more active node that's about a pontoon landing for a new bridge that's going to cross Lady Bird Lake. Here's kayak launches and more active amenities for the community. And then in the middle, we have a more passive space that is using that green space to treat the stormwater runoff from the new infill development as a way of buffering the development from the park. This view is above Congress Avenue Bridge here on the left, an existing parking lot to the right, and then you can get a sense of that 40-foot grade change that I was speaking about. And again, our idea was to fill this up against the abutment and create an arrival point here in the foreground that could be something like this, providing shade for bikes and pedestrians along the bridge with a new trellis, a new amphitheater space that negotiates that grade change and provides a much more hospitable and comfortable environment for watching the bats take flight, and then a series of great lawns and outdoor program spaces to activate the water. Those treatment gardens, again, take a series of watersheds and move them into a variety of different treatment opportunities, from constructed wetlands to flow-through planters to green streets. And because of that grade change, again, as I mentioned, this is a section through that more passive space. This is the Lady Bird Lake on the right and the new infill development on the left. By filling up that grade change, we were able to tuck our parking below grade. We're able to create this kind of transition from a real active waterfront esplanade with new ground floor retail that then transitions slowly into a more passive and immersive natural experience on the shores of Lady Bird Lake. And within those areas, then, we have the stormwater treatment wetlands that improve the water quality before entering the lake. At the same time, they create beautiful ecological amenities for the city. And so some of those structures that occur now for treatment are much more engineered, and we think that they could do more and add greater value to the public realm by increasing their attractiveness as well as their habitat potential. And so spaces like that could be transformed into more social and public amenity spaces like this. You see the bats taking flight from under the Congress Avenue Bridge and the amphitheater here in the foreground. And then other kind of, again, infrastructure spaces that are much more utilitarian and not so valuable as a public amenity along the hike and bike trails that currently exist, and the opportunity to transform those into more natural wetland areas, a new beach with kayak launching, a new promenade that is much more integrated with the ground floor development of the future South Central waterfront neighborhood. And so these were, our goal was really to help visualize the positive benefits that this infill development could bring to the city of Austin. But these, of course, will stay on paper unless there's a real financial framework in place for implementation. And Lizzie from the City of Austin will tell you a little bit more about that framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. So let me share this real quick. Right. So we just saw that. Okay, so I want to talk really briefly about the other two components that, sorry. Okay, there we go. Let's hide that. Okay, so Scott and Alan spoke about the physical framework that you find in the plan, but I want to briefly talk about the other two components, which are the financial structure and implementation strategy to ensure that this vision becomes reality. So the beautiful public realm that Alan and Scott talked about is not cheap. In fact, our estimates put it at about $100 million when you build out the entire public realm discussed in the vision. Fortunately, the framework goes into detail on a series of funding mechanisms to help pay for the parks and open space and other infrastructure, as well as assist in the financing and building of enough affordable housing units to achieve the plan's goal of 20% of all new units built in the district will be built and remain as affordable housing. Since much of this vision falls on private property, the plan, with the help of McCann Adams Studio and Eco Northwest, the plan goes into a site-by-site analysis where we built prototype buildings and pro forma analysis to understand the bonus entitlements that would be needed for property owners and developers to literally buy into the vision. So through this, we looked at density primarily to figure out how much and what type of density and bonus entitlements would be necessary to keep development feasible and to fund the mechanisms that we discussed on the previous slide. So here is the build out of the test scenario, the building prototypes that we had, as well as the layering on some urban design components on the buildings to allow for light and really build on that natural setting that we're going for. So as you can see in the bottom screen, or in the bottom of the screen, existing is about 3.2 million square feet. When we did the test scenario, we tripled development. But a tripling of development actually increased tax revenue by a factor of 6. We also, when we ran the test, we were able to build 527 new affordable units, which is about 17%, so pretty close to our 20% goal. We also, in the plan, have a laundry list of next step items. Many of them are already achieved, and several are in the works right now. In the next couple slides, I want to outline a couple of the exciting things happening right now. The first one is the trail that Scott discussed previously. This was an exciting opportunity for the city and state to collaborate together since it's on state property, and we are happy to say that that collaboration is happening today. The Texas Facilities Commission and the Texas School for the Deaf recently put out a master plan for the property, and it incorporates the trail that Scott talked about. Also, the Barton Springs Plaza that Scott mentioned, we are in the works of creating building out that plaza. In June, we had a pop-up plaza to allow community members to see and feel what it would be like when we have that plaza, and also to garner support for a future permanent plaza. Here you can see we had children, families, people coming and eating, hanging out in the area for an afternoon. That led us to a temporary plaza that is currently in design. Hopefully we'll be ribbon cutting it in the next month or so. You can see an idea of what that temporary pop-up plaza will be. It'll be up for about a year, again, to allow the community to experience it, to test some ideas, and to garner support for a permanent plaza in the near future. We also have a regulating plan that is in the works right now to allow us to really hone in on the bonus entitlements that I discussed. And since, again, it's on so much private property, we wanted to make it flexible to whatever development imagines when they come in with their site plans. So as you can see, the required streets can be a little bit flexible regarding whatever the building program is that comes in, as well as the smaller streets and blocks. We also incorporated ground level uses to make sure that this is a 24/7 neighborhood, urban neighborhood. So here you can see existing that Alan discussed, that little ribbon of green. Here is our proposed public realm. Here is the building density that would be needed if the only thing you cared about was height. You get these kind of big Soviet blocks that don't really allow for any kind of air or light into the area. But when you put in a series of point towers, you can kind of get a more dynamic urban neighborhood. So that concludes our talk about the South Central Waterfront Vision Framework Plan.
Great, thank you so much. I'll invite Christine Montour to share the screen to discuss the Millville EcoDistrict Pivot Plan.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody hear us?
Yep.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. this is a great pairing of projects because they're both very different in scope and scale. And I think today we're going to talk about Millville, which is a small town. Zaheen's going to, in western Pennsylvania. Zaheen is going to introduce us to that. I'll fill you in a little bit on this planning process, the eco-district planning process as a method, and then we're going to end with a deep dive into one of the areas of focus for the plan, and Zaheen will take us out to the end. So, with that.
Great. Thanks, Christina. Can everybody see the slides, just to confirm?
No. No, I think, are you sharing your screen?
Yeah.
We thought we were.
All right, let's try this again. There we go.
There we go. It looks like it's going now. Great.
Okay, great.
Perfect. So.
Sorry, you might. Oh, there you go. Okay, you got it. Perfect.
One more time.
Okay.
All right, are we good now? All right. So Millville is a community that's just outside the city of Pittsburgh. In fact, it's just across the river, and is in many ways a strong reflection of the city and its history itself. Millville thrived in the days of industry. We had a population that in our 0.68 square mile community approached about 10,000. But as industry abandoned the region, we had severe unemployment. We had a lot of suburban flight and just people leaving the region as a whole. And much like the city of Pittsburgh, which since peak population in the 1950 census lost about 65% of its population, Millville also lost just about 60% of its population to 3,700 or so, which is where we are today. It's a little picture of the city. We are surrounded by hills. We're located in a valley just on the banks of the Allegheny River. So just for context, again, you can see some of our overall statistics, but really through a lot of the economic depression, we do have a history of hard work, not just in the past. And these are some famous murals that are located in town, but also presently. A lot of folks that live in Millville still work in the city of Pittsburgh and have various means of transportation to get there, including a bike trail, newly redeveloped highway. However, we still have mobility challenges around public transportation that can create inequities in terms of access to job centers throughout the region. Millville has a poverty rate, an individual poverty rate of about 26.1%. We have a youth poverty rate of over 48.8%. And to add insult to a lot of those economic injuries, we were struck by some pretty devastating floods in the mid-2000s. Between 2004 and 2007, we had about 3 100-year-plus floods that devastated the business district. But in all of that negativity, really, the floods served as an inflection point, as a catalyst for a lot of development and planning that's been happening over the last 10 or so years. And for that, we have been utilizing the EcoDistrict project. Now, I'll let Christine introduce how we all got to know each other. But yeah, that's a little bit of the background of Millville.
Thanks, Zaheen. So I think what's important is for those of you who, that's a very extremely lovely project in Austin. This is a bit of a switch in scale. It's also a switch in thinking about sustainability as both placemaking and process. Millville is typical for many small towns and cities that are not in a strong market. Weak market cities that aren't highly capitalized and there aren't large-scale projects coming in have a different set of tools that they can use in order to plan for their future and to achieve progress in placemaking. So in a sense, we've all heard as planners, we've probably all heard or spoken Dwight Eisenhower's "It's not the plan, it's the planning," that quote, we like to say the race is really the prize. So the act of planning your community in a weak market city is not simply to draw pictures, but is actually to raise the community's capacity to implement things. And oftentimes those players, those folks in the things that are being implemented are not at the highly capitalized scale. They're at both programmatic and individual scale, small business scale, in a way that isn't going to be addressed through perhaps a zoning code or other municipal tools. So this goes hand in hand with those tools, but this type of eco-district planning process is as much about raising community capacity. So in 2012, our firm, Evolvier, worked with Millville to actually secure a grant for environmental education that helped us begin the process of understanding how we defined an eco-district and what these ideas meant to the community. Did baselining and project planning in 2013 and created, through a kind of community engagement process, created a document that helped understand things that were happening at small scale, who was doing little things. And this is just a kind of diagrammatic understanding of coming into these communities. There's always lots of stuff going on. However, in order to get to the larger scale projects, we need to capture those things, find out what could enable these things to get to scale, and then to provide the planning and the pathway to get them there. And so a lot of what the process included was cultivating authentic leadership around these issues, and in these particular areas, for instance, building folks who can carry it forward after the plan is done. So out of that first effort came the Pivot Plan. Pivot 1.0 was completed in, I think, 2013, 2014, and they went back in 2015 and 16 and said, well, how many things have we actually completed out of that plan? And hitting, in some cases, the 90% mark on some of the to-do list items, we decided it was time for another plan, Pivot 2.0. And Pivot 2.0 is not just an advancement of the existing ideas around energy, water, and food. It was also the addition of different criteria, starting with three simple things: energy, water, and food, and understanding the systems around those. It took a couple years, but bringing in issues around air quality, mobility, and equity then became part of the driving force of Pivot 2.0. So with that, part of that shift from Pivot 1 to Pivot 2.0 is inclusion of things like the equity ideas across those existing visions. If this were the vision in 1.0, in 2.0, understanding these kind of very technical systems with relationship to equity and how it feeds back to community benefit became the focus of these existing systems that were examined. So what I'm going to do next is breeze through 4 of these categories, not to dwell on the solutions themselves, but to talk about them as a method and why eco-district planning is different and similar to other ways we might plan. And to do that, I'll focus on energy, water, and mobility, and then we'll go into depth on 2 of the other categories. So for instance, energy. In addition to the community envisioning a future for themselves that reflects their own character, they're not a big city, they don't have a lot of heavy users or a lot of heavy producers, what can they be? And then principles around those things. Doing baselining, one of the criteria is measure, measure, measure. And so understanding what the energy use is in the community, what types of things can be done to reduce that energy use, to add to the production of energy, and then to connect it back to placemaking, which is saying there are geographies that belong to these energy flows, specifically around the idea, in this case, of energy hubs, identifying who the movers are in those energy hubs. 4 energy hub locations were identified, and by the time the 2.0 project planning project came up, 3 out of 4 of those had already been activated and were in the process of construction. So as part of that process, measure, understanding what some of the things are that have been done, quantifying that data to know how much energy has been saved, are we hitting our targets, understanding the stories behind those, and sharing those stories is just as powerful to get people to move towards action, and understanding what the perception of the community is and how this is becoming part of that community identity. So ultimately, it ends in actions, and behind each of these actions is an action plan, which I won't go through in any detail, but things, principles like gathering data, finding creative financing, building municipal leadership, and expanding renewables were prioritized actions. Behind these is a more in-depth plan to get to these goals. Similarly, water went through a process looking at a just watershed system, not just a kind of productive and pleasurable landscape. But what is important in water is that the water issues are really a regional issue. And so while things are, while we're tracking how Millville is being talked about, not just in the character of being flooded, we're also tracking what the regional, what the local requirement is to make the stormwater combined store overflow system perform better, but also who are the regional players upstream that are exacerbating the causes downstream, and how is the community augmenting those efforts to help those guys change what it is they're doing. So looking at, again, quantification, making the case, assessing the case from the 1.0 to the 2.0 plan, looking at what some of the things are that are real shovel in the ground projects versus advocacy projects that help to change a regional situation, and then what are the system and infrastructure long-term projects that need to be tracked over a course of 10 to 20 years potentially, and then creating actions that have a more extensive planning behind them and steps to achievement. Mobility was a new category and is very connected to a sense of equity. And mobility is front and center, literally in the community, because entering into the community, you come off of a high-speed, high-volume highway. And so really paying attention to how people move within the community but move outside of the community. In Pivot 2.0, really it's helping quantify how folks use the system was the emphasis. Understanding what their existing assets are and developing actions. So in this case here, we have nothing to report back on in terms of what's been done, but really helping them envision future that would be revisited in the Pivot 3.0 plan. Last one I'm going to talk about in this category is equity. And anybody who's dealt with any framework that uses equity as an explicit criteria, this is a moving target, and it's defined in many different ways. We actually find that equity is useful to spread out across each of the kind of performative categories. However, for the sake of this plan, we put it as its own category to make sure we kept it front and center and to help people understand the term equity and what that meant. And so what appeals to this region, in particular to this community, is an idea of self-determination, enablement, participation, and kind of future action. So with these principles, again, understanding demographics and information, as well as values and priorities, understanding external perceptions of the community and, frankly, internal perceptions of the community, and looking around to see what problems are likely to find Millville because of global and regional trends, and then coming up with a series of actions that, that help to advance this. Again, because this is the first time looking at this category, it's a light touch in terms of we have little data to measure, so this helps us understand what the data is we have to measure, and also helps us grab some of the soft stories that are just as important as the hard data. For instance, the creation of the Millvale Community Library, a library that had never, a community that had never had a community library before, done through the blood, sweat, and tears of community members like this particular person, Brian Wolovich, but many others who participated, as well as saying that it's not enough to just have participation, but to be attentive to community needs and who knows their community best. This is Bob, and Bob helped actually perform the accessibility index for the streets, because nobody knows the streets of Millvale better than he does. And lastly, a community needs assessment was done, is in process actually, to really get to fully a third of the population, so that we can understand what are we missing, who's not coming to the meetings, and how do we plan for that. So the two categories we're going to do for deep dive, we're actually going to do just food and air quality, and tell you a little bit more, because these are more place-based. Food, Millvale is a food desert, technically termed a food desert, and we realized that people spend more on their cars and transportation every year than they do on food. So that tells us something about their ability to access food and high quality food, as well as the fact that they're hopping in their car to get it. So in 1.0, Pivot 1.0, we looked very closely at the systems of how food is brought into the community and managed, and then proposed some things that have been built upon in 2.0. So in 1.0, we categorized areas of food production, including vacant lots and hillsides, places where things were being produced and could be produced. We looked at locations where food was being processed, whether that was professional or informal. We also looked at potential and realized that, for instance, that there are 22 either existing and being used or offline commercial kitchens in the community, which creates an entrepreneurial opportunity. And lastly, looked at points for food distribution, which is really not many, and recognized that that map needs to be fleshed out if we're going to make progress. So again, the Pivot 1.0 report card yielded a number of different projects, and particularly I'm going to talk about the last one, the Food Hub, because the Food Hub was generated out of some quantification in the Pivot 1 plan that was really interesting. In terms of the background, really Millvale's become known for both their production and their consumption of food now. So we've made some progress, and some of these things are really looking at food-based production sites. And looking not just to be able to get to the food, but enablement means choosing food behaviors or consumption behaviors that are healthy, not just consumptive. A big focus of this effort was to build businesses and entrepreneurial opportunities around it, and to put things like compost and waste streams into this kind of food category as a larger understanding of metabolism. Okay, wow, that's bad timing for a software update. Sorry about that. Okay, so that takes us to some of the data around the restaurants, around the food work. One of the things that was identified in the plan was the need for the possibilities around a restaurant cluster and connecting it to the possibility of producing some of this in situ, in the community itself, some of this food. So quantifying what a restaurant cluster would be in a kind of economic sense, how well it could work, how many restaurants it needs, what size and scale it needs to make those viable, looking at it in terms of where those restaurants are most likely to be located in the urban fabric, then backcasting to see what kinds of production might be needed to do a certain percentage of that food production, and then looking at how those two things are connected with regards to programming and fundraising and pulling these things together as part of an identity for the community, as well as the entrepreneurial opportunities to lift the community as part of the community engagement efforts, creating a kind of incubator mentality where different food business models were floated out to the community. Out of that effort, was created a food incubator, and there are about 8 to 10 different businesses that were identified and brought forward through the course of this process, and are now actual businesses that are still in Millville or maybe have outgrown actually the territory in Millville. Other place-based things to help us understand what is, what we need to know about the places and the efforts. We want to instigate interest, get entrepreneurs on board. We want to understand the place-based assets and liabilities. And we want to, in this case, inspire people to think differently about their environment and imagine alternative futures. This was the place, ironically named the Dinette Place, that existed when we began this project. It had been unoccupied for 20 years with the application of these business models and the concept of a stone soup cafe where everybody brings something to the table in order to create something wonderful. We're happy to say that this project went through various iterations and is now opened, and much like the rendering, the doors come open with both a coffee shop and community-centered food distribution center. This is Amy and Tina from the community side, and the entrepreneur who took the space over and is making that healthy food access a reality. So I'm going to turn it over to Zaheen to talk about the air quality.
Sure. So one thing folks still may not know, at least Pittsburghers don't realize, is that we still have some of the worst air quality in the country. Annually, we come in as having the worst particle pollution in the country, east of California, in fact. Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh and Millville are located, is in the top 2% in the country in terms of cancers caused by air pollution. And Millville has twice the cancer rate of Allegheny County. We have very high asthma rates throughout the region. And, despite all of that, many folks, especially Pittsburghers, feel as though the air is not that bad, because the stories that we hear are the ones of the streetlights turning on at noon because the smoke was so heavy during the day. Some folks would, in fact, a lot of folks would call Pittsburgh hell with the lid off. That obviously is not our truth anymore, but we still have challenges that need to be addressed. As far as air quality is concerned and this pollution is concerned, Millville doesn't really have any point sources. Our primary source of pollution, we've discovered, is through traffic. However, we felt that it was necessary, especially when talking about sustainable, equitable development, that not only should we be working towards reducing our contribution to pollution, but also helping people understand how to more properly interact with air quality in order to reduce the negative public health impacts that the community may feel. This meant, as a part of our Pivot 2.0 plan, again, as Christine mentioned with food, to really baseline what our air quality dynamics were in town, not just through measuring our air quality and different particle pollutants or criteria pollutants, but also understanding what the public perception was of air quality. So partnering with Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Pittsburgh, other air quality advocacy groups and researchers, we entered a planning process where we were able to utilize both low-cost air quality monitors as well as higher-end research-grade monitors to create a balance between citizen science, which we have a lot of access to, along with the university partners who really also had a mutual benefit in figuring out how to more effectively engage communities around these issues. So when it comes to monitors, we were able to distribute, again, these low-cost sensors that you see on the left throughout the community at individual homes, backyards, and utilizing kind of fancier equipment. You see Joe Kipta here, our Director of Public Works, mounting a ramp sensor. RAMP stands for Real-Time Affordable Multi-Pollutant Sensor. Now, when I say affordable, that's a relative term. That's a $5,000 piece of equipment. However, being that it's tested next to EPA sites for their quality control, it's creating $5,000 piece of equipment that would otherwise be $50,000 and be really inaccessible. This shows some of the distribution of the monitors. We selected sites that were close to the highway, that was in the middle of the business district, that was in residential areas, and even high up above the town on the hillsides, with the hypothesis that, well, we know that air pollution can get bad in the valleys, but perhaps with the wooded hillsides that we have around town, folks may be able to seek some comfort in escaping pollution above the valley. And then we tested. And we have a little animation for you. This shows particle counts as different monitors come online. And what's really interesting here is that despite being in different parts of town, you see that particles trend pretty closely to each other. This was really fascinating, not only because we saw this occurring in Millvale, but working with other monitoring initiatives in the region, we found that these fine particles track really closely throughout the whole region. And so I'm just going to let this animation play out because it's pretty fascinating to me even now. But as this plays out, what is worth knowing is while we were observing this with fine particles, using the ramp sensors, we were able to find that other criteria pollutants also tracked really closely with particle pollution. Now, we were then able to make the connection that, hey, if you're a community that can't afford fancy monitoring equipment, you don't need the fancy stuff that can monitor all these different pollutants. What you need is a good proxy for those pollutants, and particle pollution and low-cost particle sensors provided that for us. And that's actually good knowledge for us to have throughout the region, because as we work with communities throughout Allegheny County and beyond to address air quality, it does mean that you don't need access to high-cost technology in order to create community-level plans. Now, this won't be research-grade information that you can really impact state or national level public policy with, but in terms of creating hyper-local community action and helping people understand how to reduce negative public health impacts, that's really all we needed. And with that information, we conducted pre- and post surveys before showing people data and then collecting the data and after showing people data just to see what people thought. What people thought in terms of what major sources were, around what people had control over, around what could be done. You know, what was really interesting within our survey, if you look at the bottom two questions, and this perhaps speaks to the times as well as our regional politics, you know, we asked, should heavy pollution sources be held accountable for their actions? And people gave a high agree. And then we immediately asked, is it the government's responsibility to address air quality, not residents? And all of a sudden, there wasn't as much agreement. So that begs the question: if people don't think government, if people think that polluters should be held accountable, but government shouldn't be doing it, then who? Now, we may joke, however, there is something empowering within that, and that perhaps people feel that it should be communities themselves that are creating platforms through which polluters are held responsible. What that platform is, we don't know yet, but we're working towards it. People see air quality as an inconvenience. People would like to get more information and take action. And yeah, we saw that last part. This led to creating a number of, well, I guess first our theory of change, in that there are different tiers of forces here that are at play between individuals to local government to state and regional, national government. So how do we empower people through the lived experience? How do we create community through shared experience? And then build broader networks by connecting our shared values throughout the region. This led to deepening our plan around continuing to measure, around minimizing sources and exposure, and creating an informed culture, which led to ideation of several place-based as well as programmatic projects, educational projects to get people to first, again, understand and measure what the problem is and take action around it, whether it's parks with trees and an air quality beacon, another park where you perhaps have a green wall, where you have benches that have air quality monitors where people are able to see data live, a beacon where we have our municipal water tower where based on air quality, lighting will change, letting people know what the status of the air quality is, again, to help people make decisions based on tested information. And what's really great is since performing the study, we were able to create funding to start implementing some of these projects. We now have funding to create this water tower beacon where we're going to be working with researchers at Carnegie Mellon University who've been testing this technology to transmit data from our sensors that we have in town to the water tower, and then based on the air quality, the water tower will be lit in different colors. We're running educational programs through the Millville Library where folks who want to know what they can do if their quality is bad. One thing we discovered, for example, is that Pittsburgh is a region where if you open your windows, your air quality actually gets worse, not better, which is contrary to popular belief throughout the country. However, if we're telling folks in a lower income community that, to protect your children, you need to keep your windows closed, well, then all of a sudden they're having to make a decision between a heat stroke and breathing clean air in the summer, right? And that is not fair. That is an inequity. And filtration equipment for homes are pretty expensive. However, we were able to find through testing that we were doing in Millville that if you take something as cheap as a box fan and you tape a filter to the back end of it, and you run those, and if you run that device when air quality is bad, it actually has makes a market improvement in your air quality inside your home. Being able to share that information with folks and helping people understand when they should and shouldn't be doing that, again, is not a big, sexy project, but it's something that's right-sized to the needs of folks that live in the community.
So I guess with that, the kind of takeaway with eco-district planning is that whether you do have a large capitalized site and you are going to be doing a great deal of construction at one time, or you're dealing with a more quilted community like Millville, understanding these different performance areas, quantifying, working within a network of people who are enabled to actually make changes in that community, whether that's citizens or whether that's developers, and then constructing a kind of well-organized plan that includes programs, policies, and places, helps to enable the community to proceed forth after the plan is done. The race is really the prize. So thank you.
Great, thank you so much to all of our speakers. We do have a question I'd like to to share with everyone to get some feedback on. But if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to submit them via the attendee chat box. But I think this question is for the City of Austin and the first team that spoke. And it's, what approaches can I take to help cities either get on board or support and allow green infrastructure which is accessible to the public? The example that this person gave was the canals and detention was fenced off in the pictures that were shared, I think, as part of the Austin project. So does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Hey, this is Alan from Austin. And let's see if I understand the question. And could you summarize the question again in terms of how can we help implement these in the community?
Sure. I think the question is how can planners or other professionals work with cities to help them get on board to support green infrastructure that's accessible to the public, as opposed to green infrastructure that does not function as a park. It's more of a fenced off. How do you get people on board with accessible green infrastructure?
Excellent. Okay. Right. And so in Austin, we really pushed the conversation about the public realm. And so in the analysis today, we have 25% of this area technically in public realm, but it's not very nice. I mean, and most cities, no matter how large or small, huge amounts of public right-of-way in streets and roads typically would make up 25% or more of any particular neighborhood. And so in terms of getting a conversation going in Austin, it was more of the people getting excited about the idea of having a great place to visit. And it was the politicians and the other folks who actually got on board with this in a lot of ways, a community and grassroots interest in quality green spaces and public spaces. When the EPA came in, they helped enrich that conversation to say that these public spaces and right-of-ways that exist in every community could actually be thought of as a green infrastructure network to not only make for beautiful places, but make for good environmental performance. And so it's good for people, good for the environment. And so it was this kind of weaving together of taking people's natural interest in wanting to have, which started out as being focused on, let's have a great park downtown, and if we have a bake sale and raise $1 billion, maybe we can buy a bunch of private properties and do that, to backing up and saying, well, actually we have to get to the lake in the first place, and there's no good way to get there. And so it was a long conversation that really led with great places, that led to people understanding about connectivity, that led to understanding how green infrastructure can be used as a way of achieving all of these things and really integrating this into the community. And so behind the scenes and dig into the details, there's all kinds of technical information and so forth, but we did not lead with that. It was always about placemaking in public spaces.
I just would also add that this is Scott from CMG, that if we design these places to be places rather than as sort of remnant infrastructure, we incorporate how those green infrastructure pieces can add ecological value, how they can be beautiful places to learn about the environment, to inhabit, to add additional program, layer it with program, then they become more integrated into parks and open spaces and streets, rather than these kind of auxiliary, I just think that it's like it adds value and benefit to the environment if we think about them more as design opportunities rather than simply infrastructure.
Great, thanks. Another question for the South Central Waterfront Vision Framework Plan folks. The this question comes from someone who lives in Austin, and they said the City Council recently identified the waterfront area as a potential site for a Major League Soccer stadium. How would that project fit in, or not, with the current plan?
Well, I'm familiar with that particular proposal, and and that's being proposed at a different place on the waterfront. That's not being proposed for the South Central waterfront. But there have been talk in Austin about different kinds of stadiums and other kinds of large exposition facilities. And on occasion, some of the South Central waterfront has been bandied about as a potential location. It's interesting because through this very active engagement that we've had with the neighborhoods, with the property owners, with a wide range of stakeholders. I mentioned 1,500 people and all kinds of walks, talks, and so forth and so on. There's really a strong unanimous feeling from everyone and buy-in into this particular vision, which is actually kind of counterproductive to some big one-off kind of development like a stadium or for this location. And so I would say that in terms of the South Central waterfront, this would be a stadium or other kind of big thing would not fit the vision and wouldn't fit the community's goals for this project.
Great, thanks, Alan. This question, our last question we have here, is for both groups, and talking about sort of collaboration with the community. And she says these plans have involved a collaborative process of involving residents in the analysis, visioning, goal setting, identifying actions and projects, and implementation. And this appears to empower residents to action and feeling like they can make a difference. And she had sort of two questions about that. One was, how have you brought these people into the process? And I know you both described some of those ways, so perhaps you could discuss the sort of community engagement methods that you found to be the most fruitful. And then the second part of the question is, has this empowerment and working with community sort of created a feeling of ownership and pride in the community, and given them a sense of empowerment at all?
This is the Pittsburgh team. Maybe I'll answer the first part of that, and Jaheen will do the second. One is that we start each project with a very deliberate community engagement strategy that looks at who the stakeholders are that are critical to success in the project, what the outcomes are that are needed by their involvement for the project to succeed. Even when it's very early, we kind of know who needs to be around the table, and then constructing a kind of staged process. Are they just simply informed? Are they engaged? Or are they activated? And then structuring those activities around that. So for instance, in the food-related things, there was a whole effort to just get folks around the table to inform them about things. Certain stakeholders, whether they were business owners or property owners, were touched more deeply through further engagements, but also through focus groups and building networks among them, providing them support through, for instance, a Deloitte Day of Service where they came in and helped write business plans for folks, and continued an ongoing support through local nonprofits that incubate and help bring those projects to fruition. So that was kind of very intentional. Of course, you don't know everything going in, but a very intentional strategy, knowing that we needed to touch those folks for this project to succeed. But more generally, in terms of engagement, maybe you want to talk about the empowerment thing too.
Yeah. I guess to firstly add to Christine, I mean, one important piece of it is that we have to be able to meet people where they are. We have a culture of scheduling a community input session, and I don't mean in Millvale, I mean throughout, let's say, the United States, the culture of scheduling a community meeting to get people's input, having it happen on a weeknight at, let's say, 6 o'clock when people are getting out of work. However, you get the same 5 people that show up every time. And as planners, developers, we check the box and say, oh, we got the community's input, right? And that's just not good enough. So one well, two things that were really important for us was that education piece, to be able to create a shared vocabulary between the people that lived and worked in the community and kind of outside expertise that was coming in was huge for us. Then secondly, having those multiple points, whether it's block parties, something as simple as having a map that's drawn on the ground that someone can feel as though they can just put something on instead of having any sort of perceived intellectual barriers that people impose on themselves sometimes when it comes to engaging and making their voice heard in the community. But in terms of empowerment, it was really important for us to have incremental projects. The ECODISTRICT pivot plan, for example, it does dream big and it does think really far into the future. You know, when the first pivot plan was released, it was 2013, and we were talking about project end goals of the year 2030 and beyond. And that's great. But a plan that has that and that only is easy to forget and push away and have, you know, and get pushed to the back of the drawer. But the pivot plan had 1 year, 5 year, 10-year incremental projects that people could actually be a part of and get involved with, which was, again, really important for us, whether it was planting trees, volunteering at the garden, helping paint at the library. And even if you weren't someone that was involved at that level, you at least saw that something was happening. Even if it was something little, something was happening. And even having that little something happen has this way of creating a bigger base of support, where in the early days we had, 15 people showing up to these planning meetings happening in unheated, unfinished library meeting spaces, to planning meetings that brought in close to 100 people by the time we got to Pivot 2.0. So yeah, having those incremental touches has been really important for us.
Really good food and some breweries help too.
Yes.
Great.
This is Alan. I'll just say.
Yeah, go ahead.
Very briefly,
Go ahead.
one of the things in Austin, of course, is we were dealing with an area that is made up of practically all private properties, and that we're going to be redeveloping quickly. And there's this natural kind of suspicion between property owners and developers in the neighborhoods. And so some of the things that helped us bridge that natural kind of skepticism was bringing in neutral conveners, which was actually something that we had to do because we had no resources. And so bringing in the AIA that sent in folks from around the country to engage the community, then working with the University of Texas, then working with the EPA. So these all helped create these kind of more neutral places for property owners and neighborhoods to get together. The second is through this iterative process of figuring out not only how to engage the community, but what the community's vision was all about. I mentioned very briefly that we had many waterfront walks. We had waterfront talks. We had charrettes. We had pop-up events and so forth. And so there are lots of ways for people to get engaged. We worked with community artists to help people engage in an alternative kind of way. We hired a marching band to lead one of these walks. We had petting zoos at some of our meetings. And then, of course, there were the very formal processes, hearings and so forth and so on, but we tried to make something that would work for everyone. And in the end, we had a vision that also was shared by everyone.
Great, thank you so much. To all of our speakers and to everyone who attended, if you want more information about these projects, or if you want more information about the next year's awards program and maybe to submit something, feel free to go to sustainableplanning.net. That's our Sustainable Communities Division's blog site, and you can find out more information there. And then lastly, I will be sending you all a link to a survey. I think you might be rerouted there when I close down the webinar. Please do give us any input that you have. We'd love